Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to continue sharing based on the BWJ's reading today, James chapter 3. Yeah, and I'm just going to spend a little bit time to delve on the topics of the tongue. Just to recap, if you have followed, I believe, some of the sharing or your own study, you know that the purpose for the book of James first, it's written before the book of Acts. So it happens way before when Paul talked about justification by faith. So a lot of scholars didn't like the book of James because it is like a bit of contradiction, but in fact, there isn't any, yeah, because James talk about work all the time, and they hardly mentioning, about Christ. But that is not what we want to discuss here today. What I want to mention about is the reason the letter was written by James, okay, is addressed to some of the young Jewish Christians who have, in a sense, came to their faith and they lived among the Gentiles. And of course, with their kind of background, and then by living among the people who they consider used to be unclean, okay, of course, there are, what we know today is how do you fit into the crowd, or how do you live according to the way of the word or the way of the world. So it is a book basically about practical living. Okay, even though James was addressing the Jews at that early church, it is very applicable to today. Okay, so as I said earlier, I'm going to talk about just the topics of the tongue, and I'm going to call my title, "If We Could Control Our Tongues." If we could control our tongues. But first of all, as we know, the tongue, okay, it is not just the regular thing inside our oral cavity. And I look around in the English word, okay, the tongue can be a narrow strip of land that juts out into the sea. Okay, so of course a bigger landmass we call it peninsula, but a smaller one we call it a tongue also in the English word. A tongue can be a metal striker that hangs inside a bell and making a sound by hitting the side. So the thing that dangling down inside the bell, and then when it swings and make the sound, that is also called a tongue. And it is anything long, okay, a long thing projection that is transient. Those of you who are engineers, you know that transient meaning that it is dynamic, it is not static. So what we can see from the word, even for the tongue, okay, it has such a powerful impact on the things surrounding it. Before we talk about the tongue, in the Old Testament, when we talk about tongue, basically we talk about the word. The book of the Proverbs, interestingly, one day if you go and study the book of Proverbs again, it has many, many verses on the tongues. Okay, some of the favorite proverbs about tongue, I'm going to just mention a few, and if you have your pen, you can jot it down. The first one is Proverbs chapter 15, verse 4. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 4. Gentle words are a tree of life. A deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. That's in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 4. The other one is from Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18. 12, verse 18. Some people make cutting remarks, but the words of the wise bring healing. The next one is Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23. Watch your tongue and keep your mouth shut, and you will stay out of trouble. That is Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23. The next one I'm going to refer to is Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. The tongue can bring death or life. Those who love to talk will reap the consequences. Now, these are just some of the so-called reference to tongue in the Book of Proverbs. And I want to share an application story. It happened a couple of years ago, again, to one of my 3 boys. One of them, I won't mention which one. One day, we received a complaint from one of the parents. This particular son of ours, he uttered some bad language in class and nearly got into a fight with one of his classmates. Of course, the classmate's parent complained to us. Now there's of course a different side of the story, because we found out that there's also so-called other background issues of this boy who complained. But to cut the long story short, of course we have to discipline our son. But after that, my wife brought him through Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1 to 5. My wife brought this particular child through Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1 to 5. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Verse 2. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge appealing, but the mouth of a fool belches out foolishness. Verse 3. The Lord is watching everywhere, keeping his eye on both the evil and the good. And gentle words are a tree of life. A deceitful tongue crushes the spirit, which I read earlier. And verse 5. We finish off with verse 5 and say, only a fool despises a parent's discipline. Whoever learns from correction is wise. And this is one of the so-called application example. I would say that, how we try to correct our son by using Proverbs, which really touches on, the power of the tongue, how it can wreck somebody's life if it is not used properly. So why did King Solomon warn us about tongue so many times in the book of Proverbs? Some did some counting. Some counted that in the book of Proverbs, you can literally find tongues or word in every chapter of Proverbs. Somebody came up, using the English versions, there are 21 times tongue is mentioned, and 33 times the word is mentioned. So it is very obvious that King Solomon knew the power and the impact of the damage tongue or word can cause, rightly life and death. Okay, life and death in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. So now we come back to today's sharing, which is in the book of James. And the control of the tongue, okay, the control of the tongue is mentioned under genuine faith. Again, if you read, the overview of the book of James, we talk about genuine faith. Genuine faith in being obedient, which is in James chapter 1. Genuine faith in non-prejudice in James chapter 2. Genuine faith in good works, again, James chapter 2. And today, genuine faith in the controlling the tongue. Of course, later on, even second half of today's reading, we talk about faith in wisdom from God. Some say the tongue or the controlled tongue, okay, is faith, okay, and it is most easily visible and recognizable as it is closely linked or related to our real personal characters. But in today's context, I think the tongue has been expanded or transformed or morphed, what I call, into online. Okay, why is it so? In the olden days, the tongue, okay, maybe is from your speech, and not many people can write. In today's world, the tongue, okay, is in the form of online comment, social media posting, or even messaging. Okay, that is also now the tongue. Okay, in our current era. Now, again, not to belittle some people, I know this is recorded. Recently some religious people commented, on the raising of the white flag. And it is an example of the right word at the wrong time. Okay, it is less control of not say what one shouldn't. That is really a miscalculated step. A typical example of an uncontrolled tongue. The reason why, in the beginning of chapter 3, you may be wondering, why did James mention about teachers? Okay. Now, teachers, okay, need not be people who really teach in class. I know some of you were once teachers, but we can even, consider those people who lead, who disciple, who mentor, who train, or even who pastors. These are teachers. And teachers, James reminded the early Jewish Christians, because many of them want to be rabbi with, of course, it comes with a status in the society. The responsibility is great, and their word, which is their tongue, and their testimony will affect other people's spiritual life. That's why he said, in the earlier part of James chapter 3, that teachers, you will be judged more strictly. And we know that it doesn't stop. When we talk about judge strictly, it doesn't stop at the knowledge. Of course, being, with solid grounding, with good doctrine, good theology training is important. The judgment, not just on the knowledge of the teachers, but how the teacher will affect one's spiritual life, how they are leading or shepherding through the spoken word of the teachers. And we read in verse 13, chapter 3, verse 13 onwards, later on, that it touches, on the wisdom, which is the source of the teachers, which is the wisdom of God, and the tools the teacher is going to use, which is my sharing today. The tools what the teacher is going to use is basically his tongue. That is the tools of the teachers. So James said, that all of us, teachers included, we will, or one day, we will make mistakes. That is in NLT, or we will stumble. That is in the NIV version. James also indirectly said that some of us would have already made mistakes or would have already stumbled. So it is a reminder that those of us, I think everyone here included, as long as we teach, we lead, we mentor, we disciple, we share, we train, we all have weaknesses in us. That's why we tend to stumble or make mistakes. If I can draw you to Proverbs chapter 20, verse 9. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 9. And he said, who can say, I have cleansed my heart? I am pure and free from sin. Who can say? So in a sense, King Solomon, again through his wisdom, is reminding us, none of us can say that our heart is pure and we are free from sin. We will make mistakes, or we have made mistakes, and we could have stumbled people. So it all depends on how we control our tongue. The need for self-control, when we live out genuine faith, starts with taming or controlling the tongue as a measure of spiritual maturity in Christ. Indirectly, James also taught us that when we control our tongue, we can control our entire body. Okay, and that's why how did he illustrate? We can control the entire body using illustrations of the horses and the ships. Many years ago, when I was overseas, I had the chance, to ride a horse, and it is very true how one can control, a horse. The way the horse, can run faster, slower, and the directions that you want the horse to run to, all just by the bit inside his mouth. Now, this is a very strong contrast, okay, of taking the tongue versus the reality of the tongue cannot be controlled. The reality of the tongue cannot be controlled. We can read in verse 7 onwards. From verse 7 onwards, not only we read about the reality that the tongues cannot be controlled and the harm or the damage that an uncontrolled tongue can cause. What are the damage that uncontrolled tongue can cause? Not just on our lives, but on other people's lives. We read about the destructions. It can bring destructions in verse 5. We read about wickedness and corruptions in verse 6. It brings poison in verse 7. It brings deception in verse 9. And it brings curse in verse 10. So again, we can see what are the harms or damage a tongue can cause, not just on our lives, but on the people who we may be leading or shepherding. As I use a lot of the New Living Translation Bible, there are some comments, and I liked what is written here. The tongue, motivated by Satan, is full of bitter, jealousy, selfish ambitions, unspiritual thoughts, disorder, and evil. These are the tongue motivated by the devil. But when the tongue is motivated by God through our genuine faith, it is full of purity, peace, considerations for others, submission, mercy, sincerity, impartiality, and goodness. As I said, today's my sharing is quite brief and short because we know in our head most of the time. We have read through James many times. We have read about repercussions and the power of the tongue. But then through the BWJ today's reading, again, the title is called Small But Deadly. I think it is time for us to reflect also. In this pandemic, people talk about, there are many things out there. And as I said earlier, we have come to an era whereby it is no longer the speech. It is what we write. It is what we post. It is what we comment. Or it is what we forward to. And it is equivalent truly of, an uncontrolled tongue in this point of time. James reminded us that if we claim to have faith in Jesus, first we must surrender and submit to Jesus' control. One word could be pleasing to God, but sometimes it could be disruptive to others. Let me read that again. One word or our word could be, in our own opinion, pleasing to God, but sometimes destructive to others. As I mentioned earlier, the recent example of a religious guy, he mentioned something, in his opinion, it is pleasing to God, but it became really destructive or damaging, to people. The tongues show our sinful nature. I believe more so we need to pray for God to change us from inside before we can control or tame our tongue. So I'm going to end my sharing today. As I said, I don't want to, like I said, teach or even share, because a lot of these we have read through many times about what tongue is about. But the book of James, again, is reminding us, especially those early Christians, the Jewish, Christians who have accepted Jesus, and they have to live among the Gentile community. That if you want to shine for Jesus, it's either you live according to the way of the word, or you live according to the way of the world. And one of the easiest so-called illustrations, as I said earlier, is through our tongue. And it is closely related to us, as it will reveal our natural characteristic easily. And this is where people will see where our standing is when we become Christians. Today's sharing can be encouraging for us. I'm not saying that silence is gold, even though there's an English phrase that said that silence is gold, silver is speech. But I believe there is time that we need to watch over our tongue, so that others do not get hurt.